Untangling PANDAS and PANS is a podcast about two little-known medical disorders characterized by the sudden and dramatic onset of symptoms such as obsessions and compulsions, vocal or motor tics, and restricted eating behaviors, and a whole host of other symptoms following a strep or other bacterial or viral infection. I have the privilege of interviewing some of the top researchers and clinicians in this rapidly growing area, known by various names such as immune-mediated neuropsychiatric disorders, infection-associated neuroimmune disorders, and autoimmune encephalitis, or simply PANDAS and PANS. My name is Dr. Susan Manfull. I am a social psychologist, the executive director of the Alex Manfull Fund, and the mother of Alex Manfull, who died at 26 years old due to PANDAS, a disorder my husband and I knew next to nothing about, certainly not that our daughter could die from it.
This is episode 1 of Untangling PANDAS and PANS, recorded on March 28th, 2024.
We are here today with Dr. Lauren Breithaupt. Dr. Breithaupt is a clinical psychologist and an assistant professor of psychiatry based in the Eating Disorders Clinical and Research Program at Massachusetts General Hospital. She has 95 publications to her credit and has embarked on a very exciting career encompassing two broad areas, eating disorders and PANDAS and PANS. We're going to talk to Dr. Breithaupt today about her cutting-edge research investigating the role that immune dysregulation appears to play in the presentation of clinical symptoms observed in some eating disorders and in PANDAS and PANS. That is, when your immune system stops functioning properly, what role might that play in the presentation of those clinical symptoms? So naturally, as the director of the Alex Manfull Fund, a nonprofit organization dedicated to research and raising awareness and education about PANDAS PANS, I'm most interested in Dr. Breithaupt's work on that subject. But I think our listeners would like to hear about the circuitous path that brought you to this very broad category, infection-associated immune-mediated neuropsychiatric disorders. For short, we call it PANDAS and PANS. And I'm especially interested in how you got there as a clinical psychologist. So could you cast a little bit of light on that, Dr. Breithaupt?
Yes, of course, Susan. I'd love to tell you about that. Thank you for the introduction as well. So I actually started in this. So I did my PhD in clinical psychology and cognitive behavioral neuroscience. So that means that during my PhD, I had the privilege of actually working with two mentors, one who was a clinical psychologist and the other one who was a cognitive behavioral neuroscientist. So you can see, I think maybe right from the start, I was always interested in sort of this interaction between the brain and how this relates to clinical psychological symptoms that we see across disorders. But unlike sort of if I would have just done a PhD in, say, neuroscience, neurobiology, or cognitive behavioral neuroscience, I knew I wanted to figure out how to make sure whatever research I was doing could have clinical implications and that I could actually work with individuals with these disorders then, which is why I made sure that to do the PhD in clinical psychology. My PhD was actually focused on neuroimaging, so looking at pictures of the brain and trying to understand how the brain responds and functions in both a healthy way and non-healthy way across individuals with eating disorders. And when I was doing this work, I started thinking that I wasn't sure if I could understand the clinical utility of it, meaning that like how could these pictures of someone's brain and how it's functioning be translated into what we could do clinically? What could we modify? And so during my PhD, I actually left for a period of time and I went to Karolinska Institute, and it's there where I sort of embarked on this journey of thinking about genetics of eating disorders. At the time, I thought maybe this could be a way that I could find a clinical phenotype that we could modify and think about relevant for treatment. And at this time, the first GWAS, so the genome-wide association study, which is sort of like the heart of genetic studies to say that, like, yes, these are the genes associated with a psychiatric disorder. It had recently been published in Anorexia Nervosa. And one of the hits was actually in a gene related to immune dysregulation. And so from that, I had a really wonderful advisor and mentor who said that, if this is true, if it's there and if it's something to modify, we need to actually look in population-wide data to see that there's evidence of sort of immune dysregulation. And so we did this in two different ways. The first one was looking at a paper to see are infections actually increasing the risk for eating disorders. And infections meaning like a low-grade infection, such as a fever that you might actually treat with antibiotics, as well as an infection that might lead you to a hospitalization. So both of those infections, so those increase the risk for eating disorders. And the second one that established that it's sort of this broad immune dysregulation was, do autoimmune disorders increase the risk for an eating disorder? And then the reverse, do eating disorders increase the risk for autoimmune disorders? And what we found in both of these papers, using population-wide registers from both across all of Sweden and all of Denmark, was that yes, in fact, it's true. Both infections, low grade and high grade, are increasing the risk for eating disorders. And the associations that we saw with autoimmune disorders were actually much higher than we had even seen in other psychiatric disorders to date. So another one that's often cited is schizophrenia. But the associations that we're seeing between autoimmune disorders and eating disorders is almost 4 to 5x of what we've seen in schizophrenia or what we've seen in schizophrenia. And so with this was sort of my evidence to think about, like, okay, there could be something actually going on. It seems like it could be genetic, meaning that like there could be something that's predisposing individuals to both the same genes related to autoimmune disorders as it is that's eating disorders, or it could be sort of an effect that's happening post-genetically, meaning that like it could be that it's something related to the environment. Both seem to be there, which support this broader idea of immune dysregulation leading to some of these key behaviors. And that's kind of what sort of prompted and started my trek down infections and eating disorders.
Do you see more clinical psychologists ending up where you've ended up, looking at the immune system and the role of infections?
I hope so. And I think there's like definitely an interest in it. I think what's, so hard, and it's not related to, psychology, psychiatry, it's the way that our medical system, and our education system works right now, which makes sense. We've always thought of sort of disorders, phenotypes, drivers of disorders in each individual silos, right? Like if I'm a psychiatrist, I study psychiatry. If I'm a rheumatologist, I do rheumatic disorders. But really, it's that crosstalk that's so necessary. And I think that, you can even see it in some of the National Institute of Health grant announcement. There really is a movement toward trying to think about, like, how can we go across silos? How can we not be so disorder specific? How can we think more behavior specific? And then along those lines, how can we create training programs that are interdisciplinary?
And how about, do you see that filtering down into medical schools?
I hope. I think for sure. I think you're starting to see it in the research lens. I can even just talk about a little bit about the team that I'm on. So we're part of a group that's called the Mass General Brigham Multidisciplinary Eating Disorder Research Collaborative. And we called ourselves actually a collaborative because we're not necessarily independent labs. We wouldn't really say we're a collaborative, meaning that we all represent different backgrounds. There's endocrinologists, there's neurobiologists, psychiatrists, psychologists, radiologists, physicists, a chemist, right? And we're all coming together actually to try to figure out the neurobiology of eating disorders specifically. And so it's probably one of like the largest collaboratives and more sort of like interdisciplinary groups that you might be thinking about studying one topic. But I think that's one good example. Of course, we're based at Harvard Medical School, so that means we have trainees, we have fellows, postdocs all the time entering in from all different backgrounds. And one of the things that I love to do is when a trainee enters in and they have a completely different background, maybe they've never done anything related to psychiatry before, and they join in and get to learn about eating disorders, psychiatry, and bring their own past knowledge as well. And it really enriches, I think, our research and discussions.
That's great. We can only hope that an interdisciplinary program like that might develop for PANDAS and PANS. Okay, so I'm hoping that you will tell us a little bit about some of your studies related to eating disorders, but maybe you could begin by telling us, why is that such an important area to study?
Of course, I think that, so, one of the reasons I think I stay in eating disorders and have stayed in it for so long too, is because it's one of these disorders I think that's often forgotten about, overlooked, and understudied. And I don't think we ever realize the impact of it. So just like some basic stats that I always feel like sometimes even blow me away, and I repeat them over and over again. But over 30 million Americans actually will meet criteria for an eating disorder in their lifetime, which actually equates to the entire state of Texas. 10,000 per year are actually diagnosed with an eating disorder. And unfortunately, since COVID, we've only seen those rates and estimates continue to increase. And that's evidence across so many levels, right? We've looked at insurance claims, we've looked at admissions to emergency departments. This pattern has been repeated over and over again. And then since eating disorders, we think of it as a multi-systemic disease, right? Meaning that, of course, we think of it as a sort of a brain-based, genetic-based disorder. It's a psychiatric disorder, but the symptoms of the eating disorder cause an entire sort of like multi-system body approach to break down, which is really costly, right? So we're talking about $65 billion per year for individuals with eating disorders. That is the cost on sort of the US healthcare system right now. And I think it really is like this impact that keeps me here when I hear these numbers, but really it's, the calls and the phone calls that I get from parents and families telling me that they have a loved one that's impacted by an eating disorder and trying to figure out what to do for help or treatment.
Just to underscore that, it is very difficult to treat, as I understand it, that as many as one figure that I have is as many as 50 patients or 50% of the patients with anorexia fail to make a complete recovery. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it does hover around 50%. I think, and we're talking about, complete recovery. So I think complete recovery is actually a definition that as a field, we've been trying to sort of redefine and make sure we understand what recovery looks like too. There's so many different components, I think, for recovery from an eating disorder when you think of both the mind and the body. But there's actually, I think one of the things that always really drives me crazy is there's no FDA approved medications for eating disorders.
Oh,
at all.
interesting.
So
Why?
for anorexia or bulimia, there is for binge eating disorder.
Mm-hmm. What do you attribute that to?
I think probably a lack of research. There really has not been a drive for this. And, I think it's also sort of this idea that maybe they're really, really uncommon. The eating disorders are in fact uncommon. And the stereotypes, that have existed around eating disorders for so long, that it's mainly, white, wealthy females that we see, which is just not the case at all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, the whole understanding of the etiology of anorexia, for example, has changed hugely since I went to graduate school. All right. Well, I'd love to have you talk a little bit about your research, but before you get started, can you tell the listeners, just briefly what the difference is between anorexia and atypical anorexia and avoidant restrictive food disorder, which is a relatively new disorder in the DSM-5?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, so Susan, what you named is sort of this category, a broad category of eating disorders that I mainly focus on, which we think of as restrictive eating disorders. And that means that all three are united by restrictive eating, meaning that anyone with anorexia, atypical anorexia nervosa, and ARFID, which is avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, that they are not eating enough for a sufficient amount of food. And they're deliberately cutting back on the amount of food that they're eating. So the difference between anorexia and atypical anorexia nervosa versus ARFID is the motive for why they're doing that. So in anorexia and atypical, this is sort of your standard eating disorder that people tend to think of when they think of eating disorders first, where individuals are cutting back on the amount of food that they're eating to change the way they look or their shape or their weight. And I will say, that's oftentimes the initial reason for restriction. As a disorder becomes more ingrained, that becomes less sort of like a primary motivator sometimes. But for ARFID and individuals with ARFID, individuals are restricting their eating because either they don't like the taste or the texture of food. Perhaps they're really worried about a negative consequence or an aversive consequence happening. So for example, they're worried about choking or vomiting, and that may or may not have actually happened to them. Or they could have actually no interest in food at all. So we call that lack of interest presentation. And for ARFID, all three of those presentations could overlap and could occur together. So oftentimes we see the lack of interest presentation almost across a lot of people with RFID. I think that's like the majority of individuals, but oftentimes the individuals with lack of interest will also present sort of with a sensory sensitivity where they don't like the taste or texture of food. Or it could be as well with the fear one, where they're worried about the negative consequence that might happen after eating.
And to jump ahead for just a moment, RFID is often, or is one of the cardinal symptoms of PANS. Is that correct?
So I think, well, the way we think of it is that restrictive eating, I think, is the cardinal symptom, right? So anyone with PANS or PANDAS could actually have the OC presentation and or restrictive eating, but the motive behind it, I don't think has been really clearly defined. And it seems to be from clinical work that I've done, it's oftentimes in flux, meaning that individuals may present initially maybe as a fear, but then at some point in time, the body image components come up. Perhaps they go away. I think the main thing is the restrictive eating. The motive doesn't seem as clear and it seems to fluctuate. We can talk a little bit more about like why that might be the case too.
Okay. Okay, so I'd love to hear more about your research in eating disorders, which I realize is very extensive at this point. But I think if you give our listeners an idea of some of the research that you've done that may set the stage for them to understand the importance of this approach that you're going to use to investigate PANS and PANDAS, that would be helpful.
Yeah, of course. So I think one of the things to keep in mind as I'm talking about some of my research too is that my actually very first study I ever published was looking at compulsive symptoms in eating disorders, specifically anorexia nervosa in an inpatient population. It's not a groundbreaking study. It's not anything that everyone's citing all the time, but it actually ends up being really meaningful to me. One, because it was the first study I'd ever published. I actually moved to Edinburgh, Scotland to try to do this work. But I actually think it really speaks to the way that I had always been thinking about anorexia nervosa, right sort of from the start, which is thinking about this as sort of like a compulsive driven behavior, similar to like what we think about in OCD. So if we fast forward, then this was like literally the first paper I ever published. I published it right before starting my PhD. And then all this time during my PhD, and then as a faculty member, I always kind of had this then in the back of my mind, thinking about sort of anorexia as a compulsive sort of behavior and a compulsive driven disorder similar to what we see in OCD. So I did this work then looking at infections and how this could drive the onset of restrictive eating disorder behaviors and then autoimmune disorders and how this demonstrates a relationship between autoimmune disorders and eating disorders that was much stronger than we'd ever thought of before. And then around this time is when I also then began to learn about PANS and PANDAS, and everything sort of accumulated together. And it was started to then thinking about like, is there something then that's unique about a subset of individuals that means that they could have either OCD or the restrictive eating disorder to begin following an infection or from sort of this immune dysregulation? So that layered with, there was a paper that came out that was done, a working group that looks across all psychiatric disorders and looks at the genetic relationships across all psychiatric disorders. And what they try to do is say, what are the genes that are most related to each psychiatric disorder? Meaning that like, could we create sort of more broad categories of disorders based off the genes rather than grouping psychiatric disorders based off the nomenclature and the naming system that we have right now, meaning like depression's together, schizophrenia is together, there's eating disorders that hang together, there's OCD. Are there genes that actually unite disorders more like each other? And what that paper actually demonstrates is that the genes that are involved in anorexia nervosa and OCD are almost identical, and the overlap between the two are the second highest across all psychiatric disorders.
Wow.
So that would suggest, right, that if you have these sort of like patterns of genetic risk, we are not sure actually if you're going to end up with anorexia or OCD. It's actually the same sort of genetic pattern of risk that could influence one or the other. So now if we take that, and with what we know about PANS or PANDAS, right, we also, it seems like, although less research, that individuals could get an infection or they could present sort of with an immune dysregulation, such as an autoimmune disorder, right? And they may actually develop either OCD or the restrictive eating disorder. We're not sure which one. And I think that's what's really sort of like prompted me to then say, like, I think this PANS or PANDAS direction is the one that I want to go in and to think about, right? If we're thinking about something that's modifiable, right, it could be an infection, right? Can we actually treat the infection? Can we target the infection? And can we understand how it's changing? And so that's how I sort of moved into this PANS and PANDAS world. Of course, at the same time, then I was continuing to work and say, like, is there really sort of this immune presentation across eating disorders? And so some of the recent work that we've published that's coming out is demonstrating sort of widespread immune dysregulation at the level of the protein, which is the expression of the genes, right? So that's the function of the genes. If the genes sort of lay the ground, this is how actually the gene is functioning, leading to a phenotypic behavior as well. And so what that sort of continues to show is that there is this wide sort of immune dysregulation across all different types of immune-related proteins in individuals with restrictive eating disorders.
That's just fascinating to me. In your presentation that you gave to one of our small groups here at our house, you identified menstrual dysfunction as one of the symptoms that could be both a consequence of the disorder, the eating disorder, and could also contribute to the symptoms that keep them sick. Could you elaborate on that? What kind of research did you do to understand that? And obviously it's interesting, but why is it so important?
Yeah, of course. So I think this is actually such a great example of like, okay, when we find out this information, say there's immune dysregulation present, what do we do with it? So I think sometimes I have this problem where sometimes I'll think 10 steps ahead, get really excited, and then run with it. And this is probably a great example. So, right, we started thinking about, okay, it seems like there's immune dysregulation, there's this level of inflammation that we're seeing across eating disorders. So the next step then to say is like, how do we target it or what's driving it, right? So we can identify something that we can modify, right? Because a lot of times, right, what we're finding in our research, you can't really change it or we don't know how to change it. A good example I'll go back to is when I said I did my PhD all in functional neuroimaging, which does an amazing job at describing a disorder, how it works, how it functions, what's parts of the brain. But sometimes I don't know how to change sort of brain circuitry in a simple way. That's extremely complex, right? And it's going to take a lot more different studies to understand how to change that. But one thing that we know with inflammation is there are actually really key drivers of it. One, in women, which eating disorders do tend to be more common in women versus males, is actually a lack of estradiol that is result from the menstrual dysfunction. So we know about this actually from studies on menopausal women that actually demonstrate that during menopause in the phase called perimenopause, that's where we actually see the greatest decrease in estradiol. And at that time period, that's actually the greatest risk period for actually the development of Alzheimer's and dementia in women, is that perimenopause phase. And it's actually because that extreme drop in estradiol is actually decrease or increases inflammation. So estrogen itself is a neuroprotective hormone. The other time thing that we know from studies on women's health is actually when individuals are pregnant, the estrogen hormone is what's driving sort of this neuroprotective factor for both the baby and the mom. So we looked at spikes in estrogen during pregnancy and immediately after birth when estradiol patterns change. And that's where you actually see sort of this neuroprotective effect and anti-inflammatory effect of estrogen. So with those two pieces in mind, what we wanted to see is if we could actually replace estrogen using transdermal estrogen, because it mimics the naturally occurring course of estradiol that would happen from a menstrual cycle.
Lauren, let me just interrupt for 1 second. Estradiol versus
Estrogen, yeah. So that's because, estradiol is the primary form of estrogen that actually crosses blood-brain barrier. There's the estrus and the estradiol. And so technically there's never estrogen, although that is much easier to say. And it's always estrogens. It always has an S on it because there's two forms of estrogens, but estradiol is the primary sort of hormone and the primary one that's released. And when we think of what crosses the blood-brain barrier, it's the estradiol. So I sometimes simplify and just talk about estradiol.
Okay, thanks for clarifying.
Yeah. Yeah, so what we're trying to do, we actually are running a randomized clinical trial where individuals are either randomized to receiving a placebo patch, or they actually receive the estrogen replacement patch for 12 weeks to see how estradiol is crossing the blood-brain barrier. A big question is if it's crossing the blood-brain barrier. So at the end of the study, we do lumbar punctures in individuals to actually sort of get the cerebral spinal fluid, the fluid that surrounds your brain, to see if we can actually pick up on the transdermal estrogen in the CSF. And then looking at changes in the structure of the brain that are proxies for neural inflammation. With that, we're looking at cognitive symptoms and then eating disorder symptoms as well. So the idea being that, can we look at those change in those symptoms, and is that related to sort of the peripheral and central inflammation effects that we're seeing? This is, I think, like a good example of like, what do you do when you find something out? What do you do when you see sort of like widespread inflammation? Is there anything that you can target that could improve treatment?
And so the menstrual cycles, you have targeted that, as I understand, and what do you hope to find?
Yeah. So we're not done with the trial right now. So if anyone listening is really interested in actually signing up for the trial, they're welcome to as well. But what we're hoping to see is that individuals who were randomized to the estrogen replacement or estradiol replacement group, that we do see a reduction in peripheral inflammation. So looking at the blood-based biomarkers of the proteins that are involved in inflammation, we're seeing decreases in those. And then we're also seeing more estradiol actually in the cerebral spinal fluid. And then we're seeing these reductions in neural inflammation. Our hope is that those reductions are then also tied to the change in symptoms. So we're specifically looking at cognitive outcomes. And the cognitive outcomes that we're looking at, since we're talking about PANS, PANDAS, and OCD overlap, are things like rigidity and like having a hard time changing between different thoughts. We call it set shifting, which are the exact same cognitive profiles that we think of in OCD. So you can kind of see this continued overlap is always there. Especially when we're talking about cognition, anorexia, and OCD.
So in terms of symptoms, are you going to correlate that with the menstrual cycle? It's the regulation of the menstrual cycle itself?
So since we're replacing it transdermally, we're looking at the level of estradiol that's given to these individuals. So for 12 weeks, the menstrual cycle actually may or may not come back. So you might need to go on a longer dosage of estradiol replacement. So what this trial is looking at a mechanistic study to see, is there evidence of going in this direction? And then the idea would be, the next one would be to see if, you know, if we do for a longer period of time, if you can then restart the estrous cycle. But everyone that's enrolled in this trial are individuals with low estradiol levels, meaning that they have missed periods. So they have amenorrhea, or they actually have low estradiol levels. So sometimes irregular periods can actually lead to low estradiol levels as well. So all that means is that everyone that we're enrolling in the study, the replacement of the estradiol is just trying to bring someone back up to baseline where they should be at.
Fascinating. So from that, you moved into PANDAS and PANS, and I'll just start off by saying that, of course, one of the greatest challenges in this field of PANDAS and PANS is the question of, well, one of the greatest challenges is the question of legitimacy. And in part, that's because of the reliance on symptom presentation, that the great overlap between conventional OCD and restrictive eating disorders. How do you distinguish between the two? These both appear to be related to or due to an underlying immune dysregulation, but how can we distinguish between PANDAS and PANS and the other similar disorders like OCD, similar presenting disorders like OCD and restrictive eating? Is that correct so far?
Yes.
All right. So you hypothesize that immune dysregulation may underlie compulsive behaviors present in adolescents with OCD PANDAS and PANS, and restricted eating disorders. And that the immune dysregulation in those cohorts would be quite different from the immune activation in the healthy controls to which you will compare those groups. Can you tell us, is that correct so far?
Yeah, that's correct.
I feel like Rachel Maddow asking these questions. Is that correct so far? All right. So how will you test that hypothesis? Tell us what this proposed. So before Dr. Breithaupt tells us about this research that she will be beginning very soon, I'd like to say that the Alex Manful Fund is very proud to support this research. And we are also very grateful and proud to work with the Louisa Adeline Johnson Fund for Complex Disease and the Neuroimmune Foundation, two contributors to our support of Dr. Breithaupt's work. So if you will, please, can you tell us what you're going to do in this exciting research?
Yes, of course. I am so excited to do this research. I feel like it's so funny whenever I talk about it. I feel like I could jump up and down. I'm so excited to finally be doing this work too. So thank you so much for supporting this work. So what we're doing is we're trying to identify proteins that might be unique to PANS or PANDAS. And the reason being is that when I talk about OCD and when I talk about eating disorders, everyone sees those as distinct. And in fact, it took the genetic work for us to see them as really, really similar. But in PANS or PANDAS, we don't have that, right? Because the symptoms in PANS or PANDAS look identical to OCD or restrictive eating disorders. So instead, what we're hoping to do is identify proteins that might be unique to PANS or PANDAS to start to establish that there could be sort of a unique set of individuals, and there might be something sort of like unique, or we could use this sort of as a diagnostic tool, but start to lay this evidence that PANS or PANDAS might be unique, because right now all we have is the clinical symptoms. I will say that, this all started because I started seeing a couple people with PANS or PANDAS. And I think as a clinician, when you start working with individuals with PANS or PANDAS, you see how different it is and how unique it is. But when you describe it to any other provider or physician, it's really hard to tangibly say like what's unique about it or what's different about it. And the symptom overlap is completely overlapping, right? So, with eating disorders and OCD, it's easy, right? One person's not eating and the other person, it's all related to the thoughts. We needed the genes to demonstrate how similar they are, but with PANS or PANDAS, it's the opposite. And so that's what the study is really trying to do.
Well, before you go on, can you just articulate when you say that when you work with the patient, you can see that they're quite different, but when you go to put that into words, I think that it becomes more difficult to describe. Are there any words that you could find now to?
Yeah, so I think
understand that?
The rapid onset, I think, definitely is unique, right? But it's not exactly like clearly defined what rapid onset looks like, how long it is that, what's rapid onset. With eating disorders, though, what's hard is we don't really know what the onset is in an eating disorder, right? Or even OCD. Oftentimes it's onset's a self-reported symptom that is defined all different ways. So if you ask an adolescent when their eating disorder started, they might tell you about when they first started having these really negative thoughts about their body or their shape or their weight, or when they decided that, they were uninterested in eating or had this fear of eating. When you ask their physician when the eating disorder started, they might give you the date of their first diagnosis, right? So rapid onset is so hard to actually use in clinical practice. When you see it, though, when I say like it looks different, it's because the people that I work with oftentimes with eating disorders, they're not coming in and telling to me, the parents aren't saying 6 months ago that their child or their, loved one was fine, right? They're saying this was kind of like a slow buildup that slowly happened. But we operationalizing onsets so hard because then it requires, who's ever experiencing the symptoms to explain it. And that's retrospective. And then it oftentimes doesn't match with the provider or the physician. So I think onset's a big one, but it's not always like clinically particularly helpful. And it's pretty hard to define. The other thing is that like the rigidity in thought seems to be so entrenched such that, so in OCD or eating disorder treatment, oftentimes when you you work and you do like an exposure, right? So ERP, or exposure response prevention therapy, is sort of the effective treatment for OCD. And it means that you're helping individuals tolerate this extremely, extremely discomfortable feeling when they're doing the thing that they don't want to do. And you're doing it over and over and over again. But what you see in OCD is that generalizes, meaning that if someone has a fear of being on, or if someone has an fear of, let's use like germs. So they're worried about the germs with a spoon in the kitchen, and you do the exposure work, meaning that they're working, with the spoon, they're licking the spoon, they're touching the spoon, they're making food with that spoon over and over again. Once you do that exposure, and then you move to a pan or a new spoon or a fork, it generalizes, meaning that the next time you start it, it's not so hard. For some reason, whatever reason, though, it feels like with PANS or PANDAS, when you move to the next level of exposure, it feels like you're right there again. Like the rigidity in it and like is so much stronger, perhaps. But that's not something I could explain, right? Or someone could just say, well, that's just severity of OCD, which absolutely, I have no idea, right? It could be, right? So I say I wear like two different hats. One is me as a researcher where I'm asking questions, and the other one is me as a clinician where I'm saying, let's just do whatever it is that works and move forward. We won't ask as many questions. But I think when you're thinking of PANS or PANDAS, though, we can try to do what works, but what happens if it doesn't work, right? And then where do we go from there? And is there anything else that we can do?
Okay. Wow, that's really enlightening. So it also sounds like the onset may be more rapid in PANS and PANDAS, but it also sounds like it may be more dramatic. That may be
rapid and dramatic, I would say both would be true. The other one I think that is the flip between sometimes OCD and the restrictive eating disorder seems to be there a lot. So oftentimes we think of overlap between OCD and eating disorders, or like OCD and anorexia, meaning they like kind of co-occur simultaneously.
Mhm.
I've met a lot of kids that we think of the PANS PANDAS presentation, and it's like they flip. They have OCD and then they have an eating disorder, and then they have OCD and they have an eating disorder. It's quite bizarre, that like isolated switch between the two disorders. And I wouldn't say that's as common for what we see.
Wow. So what will you be doing in this study?
Yeah, so what we're doing in this study, so we are using a technique that's called targeted proteomics. And all that means is that we've targeted the proteins that are involved in the immune system or in inflammation, right? And we targeted those because so far our hypothesis is that we think that it's immune and infection driven, right? I think that we've established that in PANS or PANDAS. So by targeting them, that means we're increasing power, which simply means that we have more statistical power to find a difference, right? And it's a hypothesis driven at that level. The other part of it is considered exploratory, meaning that we're not sure which proteins we might find. So we're using a technique that's called proteomics, which is basically like searching for specific characters of a complex book. So if we take the body represents the whole massive library, right? The Boston Public Library is the body. In that library, right, we have books, and each of the books in the Boston Public Library then would be our cells. So the goal is to identify the novel drugs for PANDAS or PANDAS. We'd be like looking for a character, which would be the protein. So, right, every single book has characters, and those are the proteins that when influenced or modifies, it's going to change the entire story, which is why proteins are so key. So we think of these sort of as the markers or the characters, so to speak, that are going to change the entire story, which would mean we're changing the disease in some sort of positive way. So that's why we focused on proteins itself, right? So the genes would be sort of our books that are inside our library. The book is the cells, the library is sort of our genetics, right? And then within each book, we have our proteins. And when you change a character for the proteins, it ends up changing sort of the disease. And so that's why we focused on proteins for this. So what we're looking for is specific proteins that might be involved in restrictive eating, proteins that are related to OCD, and then trying to see if there's specific ones related to PANS or PANDAS. Of course, within each of these PANS or PANDAS symptoms, what we would expect is that we see sort of like a Venn diagram overlap. There's going to be proteins that cluster together that are OCD and PANS or PANDAS, right? And perhaps that represents more of like this OCD phenotype, right? So those proteins are changing the story. meaning that those individuals with PANS or PANDAS are expressing more of sort of these OCD-like behaviors, and perhaps then these proteins that are overlapping with eating disorders are then the ones with the PANS or PANDAS group that are showing the eating disorders. Now, the goal, though, is to find the proteins that are only related to PANS or PANDAS. And that actually then could be used in further work to sort of potentially as a diagnostic marker. Of course, we would need to validate this over and over again before we get there, but that's the hope, right? Can we identify proteins that are quite unique to PANS or PANDAS? And we would expect to see some that are overlapping with OCD, some that are overlapping with eating disorders, perhaps overlapping with all three, and then that are unique from the healthy controls as well.
Fascinating. So to go back to the one of the greatest challenges in this field, which is to identify the PANS PANDAS patient from the OCD, the patient with OCD or eating disorders. With this diagnostic marker, we would be hopefully it would be easier to identify, to distinguish one type of disorder from another type of disorder. Hopefully, fingers crossed.
Definitely, I think the goal. The other thing is, so this is considered like a targeted biomarker study, right? And I think biomarker is thrown around a lot, but really what a biomarker means is it tractable with disease progression? Is it unique from healthy controls? And the other part of it that sometimes we forget about is it easy to collect, right? So biomarkers that are, if you have to do a biopsy to get a biomarker, of course, we do that in cancer right now, but it's not necessarily easy or feasible, right? So for something like to create a diagnosis across a large population, something like proteomics could work because you can actually do this from a simple blood draw.
So do you see in the future doctors being able to order this blood test so that through the process of proteomics, we could identify these proteins?
That would be amazing. I would love to see that. Please follow up with me to see if that actually happened.
So I realize that there's a lot more to do before you get to that stage. What after this study, let's say that your hypotheses are confirmed,
Yeah.
and that the exploratory work that you're doing casts some informational light on your project. What then? What will you do with this information? And what I'm hopefully getting at is that you hope to do a large scale study at NIH.
Great. So I think what's amazing from this research is no matter what we find, we have a direction to go. So say we find proteins that are unique to PANS or PANDAS, that would be amazing. And that's what I hope that happens, right? The next step is to figure out what those proteins do. So, right, each protein has a different role in the body, and each protein is actually related to different types of cells. So the T cells, right, the NK cells, right? These are all different types of immune cells that also interact with each other. So I think the first thing is to try to figure out what it is that they do, which would require then a larger sample, more sort of complicated blood sampling process. So in order to look at cell type, then we do a process that's, we refer to it as PBMC cells, where we isolate the different cell types and then assign them to a cell library. And then we can look at the different types of cells and how they interact together. So that's actually where we're getting at modification of sort of the inflammation proteins themselves, if we can understand the cell type, which will require a larger study, hopefully from NIH, to understand how sort of these cells interact. Are they crossing the blood-brain barrier, and how they're communicating with the rest of the body. The other thing that I think that hopefully we'll be looking for NIH funding for, that all of us are going to want to be interested about, is so proteins change, right? So that's why they're actually unique biomarkers, is because they could be tractable with disease, meaning that, they could change as a result of something else going on in the body. They could change as part of a new disease, right? So then we want to look for proteins that are stable and unstable, which would require a longitudinal study, meaning that we get people in, with PANS or PANDAS, perhaps we get them during a flare-up, we get a blood sample and look at the proteins at that time period. We sample again during sort of a non-flare scenario and then another flare-up one. That allows us then to isolate and say these same proteins that we identified as unique to PANS and PANDAS, are they always there? Which might suggest that it could be sort of more genetic related, and we'll go back another route. Or are they changing a lot too? And the PANS and PANDAS proteins that we found that are unique, maybe it's only unique to a flare. Well, then if it's unique to a flare, we want to go at the cellular level, right? And figure out actually what sort of infection could be causing the cellular change as well. So definitely NIH, large studies will be the next one. Big one will be longitudinal and sort of more complex cell-cell interactions as well.
So you could track changes, ideally improvement that is that occurs as a result of effective treatment,
Yes,
ideally.
really, yes.
Okay. Incredibly exciting. What is your timeline on this work?
Yeah, so what's really unique about the funding that the Manful Foundation provided is that we actually have already sequenced all of these proteins, meaning that we actually have the data there ready to go. And what we've worked on hiring is someone with a background in bioinformatics, so a junior biostatistician that will work under myself, as well as our larger team to actually carry out the rest of the analyses. There's a lot of cleaning process that happens. A lot of data science backgrounds to actually model these changes. So the exciting part, though, is we're pretty confident we can do this in a year since we've done this before over and over again.
That's so exciting. And I guess I forgot to mention or get you to confirm that you have an extremely large data set here. Is that right?
Yes, we believe it's probably one of the largest ones out there right now. So we have 164 individuals with PANS or PANDAS, 165 with restrictive eating, 70 with OCD, and 77 healthy control. So that's 476 adolescents, so just shy of 500, which we're really excited about. And I think it's definitely is one of the larger ones that I'm aware of. I think the other part is the fact that we have sort of like the two primary symptoms of PANS or PANDAS, the OCD and the eating disorders, because it seems like if we just studied one, we really wouldn't be getting the entire sort of idea of PANS or PANDAS.
Well, I can't wait to hear more how it's progressing and a year from now, what your findings are. In the meantime, can you tell us about your medical school plans?
Yeah, so I had the crazy idea to go actually back to school. So the hope is I've done this PhD in clinical psychology and cognitive behavioral neuroscience, and my plan is actually to apply to medical school and return to medical school. Hopefully to do an accelerated program, but if that's not possible, I'll stick it through the long run and do internal medicine and rheumatology. And the reason really being is that rheumatology is the study that really gets a concrete idea of what peripheral inflammation looks like. And I spent so much time thinking about central inflammation, but it seems like in order to understand sort of like infection-driven psychiatric disorders, we need those sort of like uniting sort of features of both. So my goal in doing this is actually really to improve sort of like patient care and clinical care as well. Sometimes it feels like I'm not quite equipped enough to do anything and everything. And of course I can collaborate with lots of others, which is what I do now and it's wonderful. But I really want to make sure that, you know, if we also figure something out that we could be targeting, then I could work on actually implementing that clinically.
Well, I think I speak for everyone who's listening. We're all very excited about your study and to follow you in the many years you have left in your career. It's all very exciting. Thank you, Dr. Breithaupt. Do you have anything else to add?
No, except for that I am so grateful, I think, for you and Bill and meeting you both. And I will say that, you know, putting, I think, Alex Manful's name at the end of these papers means so much to me. So I am really, really excited to get this work out there and hopefully we can see what's different we could make.
That warms my heart because, of course, you are the same age as my daughter would have been. And it's interesting to find these synergies here. Thank you very much for this interview and for all the work that you're doing.
Of course. Thanks, Susan.
For more information about PANDAS and PANS and the Alex Manful Fund, please listen to the following 1-minute public service announcement and visit thealexmanfulfund.org.
Hello, my name is Terry Downing. My daughter Tessa waited far too long, 13 years ago, to be diagnosed and treated when she began to suffer from a disease called PANS-PANDAS. PANDAS stands for Pediatric Autoimmune Neuropsychiatric Disorders Associated with Strep Infections. Yes, strep throat. Tessa is forever damaged because of her delayed diagnosis. But there is hope, and she is a hero in my eyes.
The Alex Manful Fund is an organization created by two parents who lost their daughter Alex to PANDAS. Countless doctors failed to recognize Alex's condition in the 7 years after her obsessions and compulsions began, following a bout of strep. Early diagnosis and treatment saves lives, so they created the Alex Manful Fund. The fund supports important research like the Georgetown Brain Bank and education about PANDAS and PANS. Parents have begun to recognize PANDAS in their children and are accessing an accurate diagnosis and treatment more and more. To learn more about PANDAS and PANS, please visit www.thealexmanfulfund.org.
The content in this podcast is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified healthcare provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition.